Welcome to Stories from the Center of the Universe, the podcast about the human experience.
Gary Marx, welcome to the Center of the Universe.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Paul. I'm sure all your guests tell you the center of the universe is wherever they are at, but I think it's wherever you are at.
We'll go with wherever I am with a guest doing this podcast. Absolutely. I'm torn where to start here. I want to ask either how we connected, which is a pretty obvious story to you and me, but nobody else knows how we connected, or are you related in any way to Karl or Richard?
I have a brother named Richard, but he is not the Richard Marx, as in the singer. But since I have a brother named Richard, that means I am one of the Marx brothers. So there's that connection. By heritage, my family is originally from Germany. They left Germany in the 1840s. And there is no relation to the famous Karl Marx of the Communist Manifesto fame. But as somebody who operates in conservative public policy space, I do a lot of penance for that last name.
I'm sure you get that question almost every time.
It's great. You know, one time my wife and we talked about what we might name our son, and I joked around. I really like the name Carter, but then I always wanted to name a kid after Reagan. What if we named him Carter Reagan Marx, the most politically confused kid of all time?
Especially if he he wouldn't have the name back then, obviously, but I try to walk around with that name like in the mid 80s. Yeah, that was very cool.
So we didn't go that direction. We did not.
Probably a good move. You and I connected through Bret McCreight. How do you know Bret?
Yeah, Bret was a guy who I had met in church life back in Richmond, Virginia, and he served in the Army, active duty, National Guard, and I grew up as a military brat. My dad did 30 years in the Army, and so we just immediately connected. We had similar life experiences and connection points, living life both as military kids, but then he served as well. My wife served in the Air Force as well. So I was somebody that was in and around the military, but I got called to work on problems from a different perspective, from the public policy side, not from the military side.
But serving nonetheless.
Yes. I always like to say, if our political leaders do their job, then the military won't have to do the most difficult part of their job. And that's at the blunt end of a bayonet or a missile. We don't want our war fighters to have to get to the point of fighting a war ever. But that takes strong political leadership to avoid those issues to begin with. And too often that isn't the case. But that's why I think peace through strength has always been so valuable. We want to have peace, but we've got to be armed and dangerous to make sure that peace is always at our doorstep instead of evil and malignant forces that seek the worst for our country.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was in the Army, they taught me about the acronym DIME, so diplomatic, information management, or communications, and then economic. I strongly prefer figuring those three out before you have to use military as a last resort.
Right. Yeah. That's right. People that come from a military background or family in the military understand, war is a last resort. We're not the warmongers. We're not pushing to have armed conflict at all times. We understand the realities of that in a very personal way. So we don't want to have to do that, but we know we can and must in certain circumstances, and that armed conflict can produce great peace. And, the peace that came after the Cold War, that peace dividend that really we've been living with for the past 30 years, the entire world, in a broad way, until we saw this Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had a Pax Americana that saw major countries not coming into armed conflict in a way that might produce a World War III, for instance. We've had a great peace dividend since that Cold War came to pass, and we put it in the rearview mirror. But all that's threatened, and we may need to establish a different world order. And hopefully, it's not our military that gets drawn into this any further.
And you've acquired an expertise in Ukraine recently. Tell me how you got involved with Ukraine as a country and as a culture.
Sure. So obviously, with a guy named Marx is a last name, anytime you get involved in the former communist countries, it's an interesting place to be. But Ukraine is formally part of the Soviet Union. But they have, since 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union, turned westward. That orientation westward towards the rule of law, towards democracy, has put them in direct conflict with Vladimir Putin and his vision of the Russian world, or Ruski Mir. And that's led to the conflict that we now see as a hot war for the last 3 years, that the world understands. But even going back to 2014, when Russia crept in and took over Crimea, it began to be a major conflict then. Over the last year, I've taken 3 trips to Kyiv, Ukraine, and begun to understand the contours of that conflict in a powerful way. So it's still a newer issue to me, but I've begun to become a minor expert in the area. And those 3 trips really have changed my life. And I've seen the Ukrainian people as westward oriented, extremely faith-based. It's almost like it's the Bible Belt of Europe. The people of Ukraine would have a lot of similarities to, the people in the south of the United States, for instance. It has that very faith-centered, family-centered flavor to their orientation and how they live life. And very agricultural. It's the breadbasket of Europe. Has some of the best land that you could possibly find on earth, apart from maybe Iowa and Kansas. The richest soil and great resources. Their mineral resources and wealth has also come to the forefront in the last couple months as the U.S. has been negotiating a minerals deal with Ukraine. So it's become something where I'm passionate to see how we can get to a just peace. And can the new administration not find a way to pivot from waging war to waging a powerful peace and bring Putin to the table to bring about peace? So yeah, we're in the middle of that right now. Who knows where it's going to go, but I'm going to continue to talk about it on my podcast, Peace and Power Ukraine. And hopefully we're going to have a lot of great content from our discussion today to bring to listeners and audiences on both of our podcasts.
No, that's awesome, Gary. So my understanding of Ukraine, there are a lot of Russian sympathizers in the call it eastern fourth of the country.
Yes.
Kiev is north central. Most of the conflict, correct me if I'm wrong here, has been on the eastern front for Ukraine. And so when you say Bible Belt of Europe, you're talking about what I'd call the western 3/4 of the country kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
not the Russian sympathetic part of the population.
Yeah, more so you're going to have a faith-based entity, and in particular Catholic in the western part of the country. So very much it's Orthodox, that is the major faith in the country. Then Catholic, but not Roman Catholic. In the priests that are part of the Ukrainian Catholic tradition can get married, for instance. So there are some differences. They're not looking from historically to Rome, but nonetheless, a very strong Catholic contingent. 1 million plus evangelicals in the country, which Americans would be very familiar with. A lot of religious freedom that has allowed all sorts of denominations to thrive in a post-Soviet time period. To put in perspective, though, the war has mainly been waged in the eastern part of the country. Russia now occupies 20% of the land. So if you think about America, just take the Midwest, what was traditional Big Ten country for your football fans, sports fans out there, before this crazy expansion to California, New Jersey. That's kind of the fake Big Ten. But you take the traditional Big Ten, imagine having 20% of the United States cut out from our country. How would we feel as Americans wanting to fight for that land, fight for our families that were in occupied territories, fight because of the lives that have been lost? So this is very personal and very difficult, but they've been courageous and they still maintain, 80% of their country in this fight, in this bitter, brutal World War I style combat, but not with planes flying overhead and so much it's drones.
Yeah. World War One, if you know your history, and you and I know World War One history, I imagine some of the most gruesome fighting that you could conceive potentially, and it was like that prior to World War One. But I mean, war is brutal no matter what. But that sort of closeness, hand to hand or drawn bayonets kind of fighting is I didn't think the world was going to see that again. Right. At least not on a scale like it's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, it didn't seem like that was possible, that level of brutality could come back so easily. And we think in this technological age, that wasn't the likely scenario. So on one hand, you add all this technology and satellites and you add drones into the mix, you'd think we shouldn't be stuck in this static type of trench to trench apartment complex. Think Stalingrad plus the Western Front trench warfare. Throw those together, and that's where we're at. And drones are so ubiquitous that each combatant power can almost use individual drones to attack, a unit or even one person or one armored vehicle or one Jeep or one person on a motorbike. They're able to use drones to such effect to stop any kind of grouped war technology that we've seen, operate in World War II and other places so effectively. You can't mass troops together anymore. The Russians still do some of this meat grinder assaults. They've used even the North Korean troops still in that type of strategy, but increasingly the amount of casualties that they're taking, thousands upon thousands, upwards of near over 1 million casualties, but maybe 600, 700,000 dead on just the Russian side. It's unbelievable to put this in perspective. For America, we had 58,000 die in Vietnam. We're talking Russia, 700,000 plus. It's just beyond our imagination to think about the level of death.
Yeah, and the Russian culture throughout history has seemed to be, I don't know the best word to use here, but they seem to be okay with that level of loss, where I think Western world, and I'll speak for the U.S., I think we like, hey, we care about, at least more so than the Russians do, about loss of life, and we use it as a criterion when we make decisions, right? I'm not sure the Russians are doing the same sort of math.
No, that is part of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and whether somebody is faithful or not, that tapestry of Judeo-Christian value of life is woven into our societies, and that's why the Ukrainians, being westward oriented, they value life. They don't use tactics the same as Russian troops would because of that value that they place on individual life. And that's part of the worldview clash that's underway and we see unfolding before our eyes. So let's just continue to hope, as we have Easter just passed here, that we can get to a real ceasefire coming up. Vladimir Putin proposed a 3-day ceasefire starting May 8th to celebrate the Russian victory over, the fascists in World War II. As I recall it, it was an Allied victory over Hitler and, the Emperor in Japan. It wasn't just the Russians dealing with Germany. But nevertheless, he's proposed a 3-day ceasefire to commemorate that. Some people have said it's so that way he can have parades and not have any attacks hurt those celebrations, because even Moscow is facing attacks today from Ukrainian drone forces on a fairly regular basis. So thankfully, our administration has said that's not what we're asking for. We've been asking now for more than 100 days for a real ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire at minimum, something to show that you really desire peace and that we can end the bloodletting in Ukraine and in Russia. So that was a very strong message that was sent yesterday by the State Department. And we can hope that begins the process of a real ceasefire. That's what everybody's hoping for. Ukraine wants to come to the table and have peace, but we just don't know if Vladimir Putin is interested in that yet. It's hard to tell what his motivation might be at this precise moment. But I think we are at a pivot point with Trump and Putin in terms of their relationship. It's put up or shut up time.
Yeah, I think this really comes down to, will Putin accept complete withdrawal and then end the war after a 30-day ceasefire? He doesn't seem likely to accept his complete withdrawal. And to your earlier point, if this happened in the U.S., we would not stand for a foreign adversary occupying 20% of our land.
Yep. And it's a little bit more akin to, I think for our listeners to understand, think about the Civil War when it was brother versus brother. And there is such a close, confined relationship because they were all together under the Soviet system for forced that way, at the grip of communism. So, and there's this shared language and shared history in so many ways, but that's a big part of what this is about. Vladimir Putin does not want to let there be a separate Ukrainian cultural identity. And that separate language, that separate heritage, that's always been a thorn in the side going back to, Soviet times when the Soviets intentionally starved upwards of 5 to 8 million Ukrainians in a systematic way as communist principles were put into place to collectivize the land. So there are deep cultural wounds going back to the 1930s where millions had lost their lives. I'm here in Washington, D.C. today, and just a couple streets over from where I'm recording, there is a monument to Holodomor, the intentional starvation of the Ukrainian people in the 30s. So here we are with deep conflict nearly 100 years later. So there's so much to this, and the deep hurt and wounds that are part of this go back decades and decades.
Yeah, my understanding of Soviet communism in the 30s and 40s, basically when Stalin was in charge, I saw some incredible stat years ago that said, we know we lost 3,000 folks at Pearl Harbor, roughly the same number for 9/11. There were 27,000 people dying per day from, I think it was September of 39 to some point in 1945, every day. 9 times 9/11 every day for over 4 years. That's incredible.
It's hard to imagine our society today being able to withstand even a small fraction of that type of loss. It's why we look back and think that truly was the greatest generation. They truly rose up and met the call of purpose that those times required. And I sometimes think, well, maybe it was because they were already living through the Depression, they were hardened and steadfast and prepared to go into World War II. And without the Depression, maybe psychologically, they wouldn't have been able to be prepared and hardened in that way. But that's just my personal theory, kind of looking back, playing psychology 101.
I think you're probably right. And the world, forget Depression, take a longer view. Mankind is experiencing an easier existence today. You go back 100 years, there were no hot showers. Just right. A lot of things, just unbelievable change in that 100-year period. And I think when you don't struggle, you maybe can't rise up to the occasion of World War II or what we had to do.
Paul, did you see any of this coverage coming out of Spain and Portugal when they had their catastrophic power outage this week?
I did not.
And what happened to the society when quickly there wasn't money payment processing systems, trains and subway systems couldn't operate. There was no gas to be able to pump into cars because of no power for the gas pumps to run. It was catastrophic. A turn back to the Stone Age like that. And, minimal backup generators even prepared for the hospitals to run. It was a scary situation to think, how quickly, you go back as a society. But yeah, take a look at some of those stories. Eye-opening. There's a lot of story to be told there. I think that's still going to come out.
Yeah, the Spanish and the Portuguese experienced the level of anxiety that my kids would experience if I took away their iPhones.
Right. Every now and then I try to spend, just put down the phone even for an hour. Like, test yourself. Be on an airplane. Okay, don't touch your phone for the whole flight. See, some of those kinds of things. Can we do it anymore?
Yeah, can I even do that? Yeah, it's amazing how much things have changed since you and I were kids to what our kids have experienced. Right. The idea of NATO being a big part of how this started. Where does NATO fit in all this these days?
Sure. From my perspective, NATO has been the most successful treaty organization possibly in the history of all mankind. Its effect and success at stopping any war from happening, any hot war from happening during the Cold War and with any NATO country has been outstanding. The Russian propaganda line is that NATO coming to its doorstep has forced it to attack Ukraine, and that they had no other option because NATO was threatening it. Well, the truth is that as a treaty organization, NATO does not do offense. NATO only has defensive capabilities. Its Article 5 does not come into play as an entity unless it is attacked. So the results of what has happened is Russia has attacked Ukraine with that as one of the predicate problems that they claim forced them to this. But they've ended up building NATO into a stronger force because you've had Finland and Sweden join NATO. You have then woken up Europe from its military slumber. And they're going from 2% of their GDP for defense to 3%, 4%, 5% in the case of the Baltics and Poland, I think, moving very quickly. Even Germany, for the first time since World War II, is moving to a position where they are beginning to rearm in ways that they haven't since 1945. You have a new government that's been elected in Germany that is pro-Ukraine and finally realizing that maybe they can't be dependent on Russian energy and infrastructure like they had allowed themselves to be. Unfortunately, they shut down most of their nuclear, I guess all of their nuclear at this point, and they maybe need to reassess that so they can withdraw from Russia's control. But your original point was NATO, and I think that in every way that we assess this, we can bring this to a conclusion where maybe Ukraine's not part of NATO anytime in the near future, but NATO has now been strengthened as an entity, and they will be prepared and awake for any future Russian aggression. And I think you have to assume there will be more. As long as Vladimir Putin is there and his ideology of Ruski Mir exists, then you have to be prepared for more Russian aggression. The Ruski Mir ideology is one that means Russia has no borders. It's a Russian world. Its borders are limitless. It's similar to the Islamic thinking about a caliphate. There is no end to where Islam can spread in that ideology as well. So similar in those ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like the Russians are anchoring to an extreme position, which leaves everything else from the extreme to their current situation in play for them.
Yeah. They want to rebuild the empire. They want to reconstitute their former glory. For Vladimir Putin, it was a deep personal psychological trauma when, as a KGB agent in, I think, Dusseldorf or Dortmund, the wall came down, the KGB headquarters were ransacked, files were taken, everything was exposed, and the Russian Empire was dismantled. That was a psychological trauma, which he is acting out to undo. So we can understand why, as a KGB man, he has taken the road of aggression. I think it's understandable, but what's not understandable is for the West not to wake up to the realities of that worldview that he's now pushing.
Yeah, you and I were speaking earlier this week, and I'd mentioned people that lived through the Cold War, like Gen X and baby boomers. And yeah, when we think of Russia, we're really thinking of the Soviet Union and what their desires are. And yeah, if Putin could push all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, I think he would consider it.
Yeah, and my hope is that we can, of our generation, Gen X, we can help these next generations of millennials and Gen Z and whatever, Zoomers, whatever we want to call them, help them understand the lessons that we had learned during the Cold War. And that some of those lessons have to be relearned as we look at the Russian mindset and realize how much of that old communist mind is still ingrained there. It's part of the original operating system, if we want to think about it in those terms. I was watching the Steve Jobs movie the other night, and just thinking about how crazy it was when they were first putting together computers and thinking about, okay, we need an operating system. We need to have just an interface on how to do things. Well, the Russian operating system is still communist to the core. There's so much of that mindset and how they do propaganda, how they do diplomacy, which is first and foremost still Soviet style in every way, shape, or form.
Yeah, you said something earlier about what people of faith, what the breakdown is at a high level in Ukraine. And I should have asked this earlier, so I'm going to pivot in a weird way right now. The idea that there are Catholics that don't consider themselves Roman Catholics. I'm 56. I've never run into that before. I married a Roman Catholic,
right,
and everybody I know loves the Pope, right? That's a Roman Catholic. So tell me what the differences are. They live a Catholic life, but they're not beholden to what's coming out of Vatican City?
Yeah, I am not a Catholic by tradition, but I did learn some of this as I got into Ukraine. And 22% of the population is Eastern Catholic, and they're looking to going back to the split in the church between Constantinople and Rome. So it goes back that far. So the different strains, so the Eastern versus Western, and who they were looking to as their papal authority.
Because I'm familiar with Eastern Orthodox at a very high level,
right,
but I didn't realize there was such a severe break and that there were that many in Ukraine, and I'm guessing there are others outside of Ukraine.
Oh yeah. The layers of the onion are incredible because this area of the world has so much more history than we do. As Americans, we're looking back, okay, next year, 2026, we're going to do this 250th celebration, and it's going to be a really big deal. And they're like, that's a quarter of a millennium, and we're doing 4 or 5 millennium deep on some of this stuff when we think back, because we look at world history going back to the Middle East. Well, just above Turkey is this intersection, this crossroads with Ukraine. And Ukraine is at the land bridge crossroads of all these trade routes. And there's so much history there. Really, the history of of Kyiv, for instance, goes back little less than 1,000 years, and it pre-existed even the existence of Moscow. So this is a deep issue also because Kyiv is the headquarters of the Orthodox tradition. Moscow was after that. They looked to Kyiv. The St. Sophia Cathedral that is in Kyiv, that's even as much as anything, that's what they want to conquer and take over. They don't want to destroy Kyiv and destroy their religious heritage site. That's almost like Jerusalem for the Orthodox tradition in that part of the world. So the level of spiritual component to this fight is significant as well.
You tell me where I'm wrong here, but you're a political consultant. You're a public affairs consultant. You've worked on many campaigns. How did you get into this line of work? Was this something you aspired to be when you were a teenager, or did it come later?
Yeah, I go back to my first interest in politics I was just a military kid, living overseas. I think I was living in South Korea at the time. My dad was stationed in Seoul. We were there because it was the front lines of the Cold War in the 1980s. And I remember the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happening and watching that on CNN. CNN was kind of a new thing at the time. And that really interested me in geopolitical things. And, here I was on a military base and we'd hear SR-71 spy planes fly over on a daily basis, fly over our school and do runs in the North Korea, taking pictures and understanding, there's an existential battle between communism and the freedom that we enjoyed in the West. So I lived with understanding, okay, politics is important. All of this stuff matters. And then just in a lighthearted way, there was this great TV show called Family Ties. And Michael J. Fox played the character Alex P. Keaton on this show. And he was a young Reagan conservative Republican. And he was supposed to be the butt of the joke, but it turned out he was an inspiration to a lot of people. And a lot of young people like me identified with him and kind of saw, oh, that's what a Reagan conservative might be like. Yeah, I want to go check that out. I want to go down that pathway. So I studied political science at James Madison University. And, I lived in Fairfax, Virginia, a lot of that time period growing up. And I would intern every summer on Capitol Hill. And, Washington, D.C. was my backyard. So I got comfortable with it and used to it. And that was kind of my gateway into politics.
Yeah, it's funny that Family Ties. He was supposed to be the butt of the joke, but there were so many kids and even adults that related with him. And like, there's nothing funny about this. This is how I view the world.
Right. He had these hippie parents. They were from the 60s. They were flower power and they had 3 kids. And, the comedy of the show was, one of their kids, their oldest son was the opposite of them. And it was just genius. I'm sure you can find it on one of the streaming platforms, but for folks that are in the audience, it's worth going back to. It's a little bit of a cultural commentary from that period. But, he had baby boomer parents and they're still hanging on. They don't want to pass that baton on to Generation X, but it's slowly starting to happen.
No, it was a great show, very entertaining, and it was thoughtful about what was happening in the world those days. You mentioned South Korea, living there. That's awesome, and got to be a bit lonely to be living in a foreign country. You're sort of this. Well, how many years out of your childhood did you live overseas? I
was there 2 years. I was in Germany for 3 years. And then, believe it or not, the military counts being stationed in Hawaii as overseas. So we lived there for 3 years when I was very, very young. But in my dad's 30-year career, he would have had those 3 overseas assignments. So 8 years out of 30, he was technically overseas.
And that was all Army, right?
Yep. All Army for, his 30 years. Yep.
Yeah, I was telling Bret the other day, only the U.S. Army can find the worst real estate in Hawaii and put a post there.
That's right. And ironically, my dad didn't want to go to Hawaii. he had family that had left the Pittsburgh area and had all moved to Alaska in the 60s and 70s when the oil boom was happening. And, they were giving out money to anybody that would become an Alaska resident. So he had family that moved there. So he requested that the Army send him to Alaska so he could be near to them. And they was like, as the Army's prone to do, we're going to do the opposite of what you want. You're going to Hawaii, buddy. So good luck.
You want to go to a cold place with oil
right
drilled,
but
we're going to send you to a beach kind of place. Yeah.
There's always payback in the Army, though, Paul, because as soon as the Hawaii assignment was done, then they sent him to Syracuse, New York. 140 inches of snow every winter. Good luck. You go to Hawaii, you go to, I told my parents, I was still young at the time, I was like, you know what? White is not my favorite color.
Yeah.
All this snow, I was just like all the vibrancy of Hawaii in the rearview mirror, and you're looking at, white snow everywhere. This is miserable. What's going on? But yeah, I came to like it.
There's a white out for 5 months out of the year kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Was he at the university?
Yeah. He was the ROTC instructor for 3 years at Syracuse University. Yep. Right next to the Carrier Dome there on campus.
Okay, cool. So how much of American culture did you not really appreciate because you didn't live in the U.S. your entire childhood?
Yeah, it was tough, but not impossible. So everywhere, to let your audience in, there's armed forces networks. So you would have some television access in both Korea and Germany, and you would have some American programs that you would get. And usually that would be delayed. You'd get things maybe 6, 7, 8 months behind the normal program. So in some cases back then, we would have our grandparents, put a VHS tape in during the night, record programs, and then mail us the VHS tape. And we would be able to watch things before anyone else because you'd get a VHS tape mailed to you. So that was the idea. So you could be ahead. And, my one grandfather was really good. We still have a lot of the tapes that he sent us because VHS had become ubiquitous starting in 1985, 1986 in there. I still remember we bought a VHS player at the base exchange, the PX in Seoul, Korea. And, it was like $50 or $60 to buy the player. And then we bought Back to the Future, the movie on VHS tape. That was like the first thing that we had to play. But you were limited, on timing of culture from that phenomenon, not music per se. You'd get music, but it was clothes. You'd be way behind on clothes. So you didn't want to go back to the States in the summer and show up and you didn't have any of the in-style clothes as a kid. That was always one of those issues. Like somebody, you'd hear, hey, they're getting a new shipment down at the PX. There's sports gear that's coming in or something, popular brands. Like, hey, you got to get down there fast before everything's sold out. And it would sweep the community and people would be rushing down because you didn't know when you might be able to get stuff. Of course, I'll end on this. In Korea, they did have all sorts of American styles because it was all bootleg. They would sell all this Ralph Lauren gear and clothes, but the Ralph Lauren horse would only have 3 legs instead of 4. There's always stuff that was wrong. In that era, all this bootleg material, you'd say Korea is the land of the almost right. Everything was just a little off, from being the true American brand, because they were bootlegging so much.
So sort of the B+ version of whatever the American version was.
Yeah. I'm sure they had all Prada and all that kind of, fancy brands, but it wasn't real. Dolce & Gabbana, all that stuff.
Sounds like New York actually too.
Yeah, I'm sure they made it in Korea and shipped some guy in New York, and he put it out on the street.
Exactly. I love the fact that the most efficient way to watch what was out on movies and TV was
but if you had TV movies, that was a big deal in this, even into the 90s, made for TV movies. That was kind of a thing. They would advertise them, and he would just record anything too. My grandfather was not always prescient on what was actually hot, the cool shows. He just put in the thing, record 5 hours of primetime TV, drop it in the mail. You didn't know what you're going to get.
The fact that it was your grandfather mailing VHS tapes sped up the process by 6 or 7 months is just, it's fantastic.
Yep.
I'm definitely going to keep that one in the noggin for a while. That's what part of Germany were you guys in?
Wiesbaden, Germany. I lived there for 3 years, finished my high school years there, and then back to Washington, D.C. after that. It was a luxury assignment, far back from what the front lines of the Cold War would have been. It was more of a headquarters, and there was an Army air base. There was a huge Air Force hospital. Back in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of hostages taken in Beirut. We had CIA operatives and soldiers, Americans of all types, were being taken hostage in those early years when militant Islam was really getting a foothold and destroying Beirut. And when we would negotiate or get these hostages back, they would be usually taken directly to the hospital in Wiesbaden, Lindsay it was the Air Force hospital at the time. That was a place that was very prominent until things began to switch to Ramstein Air Base later on when that shut down. So yeah, Wiesbaden was known from that standpoint. And then if you've read the New York Times, even just in the last couple months, a lot of people discovered that the current war operations where the American military partnered with the Ukrainian military, all of that was being operated out of Wiesbaden, out of Clay Kaserne, which my father was a battalion commander at that exact installation in the 90s when I was in high school. So it's rotated and turned around, and now we see that some of these outposts from the Cold War are still involved in fighting the Russians even today.
Wow. Wiesbaden's in what part of the country?
Right along the Rhine River, so the Rhine River Valley. It's on one side of the Rhine. Mainz is on the other side of the Rhine. Mainz is famous because that's where Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, changed the world, printing the first famous Gutenberg Bible there. So a lot of things have happened historically, at the crossroads of the Rhine River. A lot of Roman history coming through that area. So highly recommend it. It's vineyard country. It's kind of the spa town of Germany. There's a lot of hot springs naturally. So if you're going to visit Wiesbaden, you fly into Frankfurt. It's about a 20-minute drive from the Frankfurt airport to Wiesbaden. Absolutely beautiful. Highly recommend it. Easy flight to do. Frankfurt is one of the world's busiest airports, like Atlanta, so easy to get to.
I wish I had met you 6.5 years ago. My wife and I were in Germany back then because I wanted to see where I was born. I was born in Würzburg, just north central part of Bavaria, and I think I actually found the building that I was born in, and it was it had been turned into condos and a day spa. That hospital.
That's amazing. My wife, her father was in the Army, and she was stationed in Würzburg, and then moved after 9th grade, 10th grade in Würzburg. She moved to Wiesbaden and did her last 2 years of high school in Wiesbaden, which is where I met her. So yeah, she's got a Würzburg letter jacket in the closet somewhere.
Oh, that's so cool. Please take a picture of that and send it to me. That's
okay.
Amazing.
Yes,
the world's small, man. You guys met in an American high school in Germany.
We did. We started dating like February of our senior year, and by that point, you've already decided like where you're going to college and all that. But yeah, they invented this thing called the internet, and then we decided, hey, maybe we can do this long distance dating thing, and
wow.
The internet helped.
Yeah. Well, so when you graduated high school, how quickly did you come back to the U.S.?
Yeah, I was back in Northern Virginia. My dad was stationed at Fort Belvoir during my college years. And I went to James Madison during university during that time period.
And your girlfriend then, wife now, she was in another part of the country?
Yep, she was at the University of Illinois. She was in the Air Force ROTC program on scholarship. And, did that for 4 years and then paid back the Air Force for 4 years active duty.
That's amazing. Gary, you're different than me. I'm sure I'm not no comment about your wife
Right.
or my wife, but I February to early summer with each other, and then long distance for 4 years, and now you're married. That's pretty unusual too.
Yeah, it's an unusual story, but I guess it's a good fit for being at the center of the universe, Paul.
Nice. You've been on a lot of political campaigns. I mean, names everybody who follows politics, especially if they're over the age of, I don't know, 25 or 30.
Mm-hmm.
Names like Rubio, Romney, Walker,
Bush.
Bush. Yeah. Tell me what it's like to be part of those campaigns, because I have zero clue what it would be like to be a member of those campaigns.
Sure. Yeah, it's exhilarating. I tell people I've been on, I think, 6 different presidential campaigns now, and I've been part of 9 Supreme Court fights, which are kind of mini national campaigns. So a lot of my career, I've been in and out of those spaces. And, I learned early on that I enjoyed the campaign fights more so than just being a policy wonk and being in the minutia of the legislative battles. So in this line of work, there's campaign season and there's legislative season. And some people, just want to do that legislative side. And I've got the Capitol behind me right now. And that's, it's a great calling. It's important work. But I have never gone on the inside. As close as I ever got to it was being an intern in a congressional office. And otherwise, I've always stayed on the outside and wanted to be. I just found it more exciting to be on the campaign side of things. And, I love national conventions. Back in the 80s, when I first started following politics and that era, I remember watching the national conventions with my grandfather, watching the 1984 Democratic Convention, the 88 Convention, 92, like in my very early years, and thinking, wow, that's amazing. That's so exciting. I want to be in the middle of that. And then I got a chance to do that and be on the floor of many conventions, and even got a chance this last go around for the convention in Milwaukee to be there in some of the suites on the big nights 2, 3, 4. It's amazing, the exhilaration of that, and you realize history is being made one way or another. History is being made, and you hope that the leaders that are coming into power are having an opportunity to influence history for the better and change things. And, for instance, have a chance to bring peace to very difficult situations like what we're seeing in Ukraine today. And that's what makes it all worthwhile.
The energy at that convention, I imagine, is otherworldly, right? I don't even know how you could describe it, but could you give it a shot?
Yeah. This summer was incredible because the unity and energy at the Republican convention was like no other, because of the assassination attempt that had just happened the week before with President Trump in Western Pennsylvania. And that happened, just a few miles north of where my family is from in Western Pennsylvania, northeast of Pittsburgh there, in Butler, Pennsylvania. So that was very close to home. And Trump arriving and all of the unity and energy, it's like nothing I've ever seen before. The closest thing was the 2004 convention for Republicans in New York City. And that was coming off of 9/11 and the battle against the war on terror, and the unity that brought to the country was still really strong at that 2004 convention, well before really Iraq had started to fall apart. And that's something we can litigate a different day. But at that time, tremendous unity at that convention because of what had happened in New York City at 9/11. And then, President George W. Bush knew, hey, if I'm going to have my convention anywhere, my reelection convention, we're doing it in New York City. I want to remind the American people of that moment and us coming together. So that was very powerful. But this summer in Milwaukee was even more so.
Yeah, the parties in 2004 and in 2024 were clearly, the Republican Party was clearly united on both occasions. But back in 2004, the country was united. I mean, there are always going to be the edges, but it seemed like I don't know, 80% of Americans were united for the years following that. And roughly 20 years later, we seem to be pretty far apart these days.
Right. Right. Yeah. Republicans don't often win the popular vote in modern times, but they did so in 2024. The previous time was 2004. Yeah. George W. Bush's reelection was the last time they'd won the popular vote. Another big victory of that scale was 1984. So for Republicans, it's been about a 20-year cycle. So I don't want to jinx it and say you're not going to see another victory, Republicans, this big until 44. But on this scale where you have total control of the government and you've won the popular vote, that is rare. That's a rare thing for all of those factors to come together. So don't squander it. That's my message to President Trump, to this administration. Do what you laid out and you promised you would do. And, that's got to produce results, not just economically and on social policy and immigration, but also in the national security space, bringing a just peace in Ukraine, for example. And, not selling them down the river, not having a debacle like Biden had in Afghanistan. So don't let that type of result come to Ukraine.
No, yeah, I'm with you. I didn't think I would see what happened with the withdrawal, if you can call it a withdrawal. It was certainly not planned. And what's interesting about that particular debacle was we had left Iraq in a much better, much more orderly, well-planned. It was a deliberate process, and Afghanistan was the opposite of that.
Right. I'll never understand why you couldn't have that type of withdrawal or drawdown, whatever process, where you leave some minor elements in place to have stability, or at minimum, just have Bagram Air Force Base as co-managed with the Afghanis, where you had enough of a footprint that the Taliban wouldn't have taken that out. It's like having a permanent aircraft carrier at the gates of China. Don't you think that might have been useful as Trump wants to pivot towards dealing with China, and as our country might need to pivot towards dealing with it in a more direct way? So it seems short-sighted and mishandled in so many ways, but just from a geostrategic standpoint, I'll never understand that part of it.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about Ukraine. You've obviously invested a lot of time and energy into that country and their situation there. But you also have experience with Israel, and that's where the other major conflict is these days. But tell me about your position and your thinking on what's happening in Gaza and Israel generally.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a first chance to visit Israel in 2014. And as part of that trip, we went to the fence line of Gaza. We were in Sderot in the south of the country. We were in a neighborhood with Israeli families living there within viewing distance of the fence line. In the police station in that village, they had a huge storage area of missiles that had been fired from Gaza at the neighborhood. Each one of the bus shelters in the neighborhood was actually built and designed to be a place where people could run to, because once the sirens went off for a missile strike, you had less than 30 seconds to get to someplace safe, indoors or at the bus shelter there. So that was a very real moment of understanding just how real and close and personal this was. It's almost like those trenches in World War I that we talked about. It's that close of a distance where you have populations that are living within proximity where one hates the other. Where a strip of land, Gaza, is fully engulfed in a death cult, which is what Hamas is, dedicated to destroying a people group and destroying a country, Israel. And they want all the land from the river to the sea, and they were serious about it. And what we didn't understand is, even going back to when I visited there 10 years ago, that they were beginning to build this infrastructure of tear underground, and they were planning and carefully trying to begin a process to find a way to initiate an attack on the level of what they did on October 7th. And I don't know that I've ever seen the face of evil as clearly as what all of us saw in those GoPro videos that the terrorists recorded, because they were proud of what they were doing. They were absolutely proud. They were calling back to their fathers and grandparents in Gaza and saying, I killed this many Israelis today. You'll be so proud of me. As they held hostages, they were proud of what they did. They recorded it. Even the Nazis did not record for posterity what they did. They knew to be ashamed of the killing and the Holocaust of the Jews, but the same type of ideology has taken root so much in Gaza and in Hamas that they recorded it and bragged about it and wanted the world to see exactly the type of killing that they were doing.
Yeah, and back to Judeo-Christian values, Israel, I don't know what it's like today, but prior to October 7th of 2023, Palestinians worked in Israel. They worked all over the country. They work. In fact, there are Palestinians that are citizens of Israel, right? Yes. Very much hey, as long as you're a contributing member of society, hey, you're welcome here. And
right.
Hamas clearly is, they're
Israel is a multi-ethnic society. There are Arabs that are there. There are Arabs, Israelis who serve, who are Muslim and serve in the military, who serve as members of the Knesset. It is a Western multi-ethnic society, multi-religious society, and Hamas can't stand that. And while they were sending their workers into Israel to make money and have jobs, they were acting as spies and coming back and helping Hamas plan October 7th.
Yeah, it's history keeps repeating itself, right? You can take those sorts of I'm really an undercover bad guy, but I'm going to pretend to be a good guy for a few years, but all the while I'm feeding information to your adversary. Yeah, wild. Well, Gary, we said I think 45 minutes to an hour. We're a couple minutes before an hour.
Great.
I really appreciate you doing this. I'm not used to doing video, so you can tell the lighting where I am is not good at all. So my apologies for that. Your lighting is much better because you're in a production studio, effectively, right?
Yeah, I've got some great friends that help put all this together, and I'm so grateful to be able to use technology and be part of the stories from the center of the universe. So thank you, Paul, for having me today. It's been a real honor.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd also really appreciate if you'd rate and review us. You can find us at scodupodcast.com.